We are now to the conclusion of the brief outline of the pattern of development of the Pilgrim Holiness Church. I would like to say this. The Pilgrim Holiness Church was always a very evangelistic church, and in some ways did not fully become a church in that sense, because we took so many hundreds, and I would suppose thousands of converts into our churches who eventually ended up in some other church. And not basically because there was anything fatally wrong with the Pilgrim Church, but because it kept such a heavy evangelistic emphasis that it was more or less an evangelistic society in its traditional history than it was. But it's still, the point I want to make is it still grew at a very healthy rate, not through mergers. There were many mergers of little groups which came together, but they were very small. Even the California merger, I think, was only 700 people coming when the Pilgrim Holiness Church was formed into the rest of the church. But by the time of merger, the church had grown to a size of about, I believe, 36,000 in this country, and about 20 or more percent overseas of that kind. At any rate, when we merged, and we'll get to the Wesleyan Methodist Church in a moment, the two churches were about identical in size, which was very healthy for the merger situation. And we'll try to talk a little bit about that. So the second body, which forms what we are talking about here finally as the Wesleyan Church, and as Dr. Abbott would remind us all, be sure you capitalize the T. It's not the Wesleyan Church, it is the Wesleyan Church. All right, the official title, of course, is with the capital, which was the point he is making. The Wesleyan Church, second member, is a much older church than the groups we have been talking about. And the reason I began with the newer group, because it was started in 1897, whereas the Wesleyan Methodist Church goes back to 1843. In May of 1843, the Wesleyan Methodist Church was formed, and we'll get to that in just a moment. The reason I did that was because the Holiness Church follows out of the mainstream of the revival. The Wesleyan Methodist Church is a split off of Methodism, very early split, over the question of abolition. The whole race question, which has plagued America ever since its beginnings, at least since 1619 when the first slaves came over, the race question is still not settled, unfortunately, but was certainly not settled before the Civil War. In fact, it was going the other way. Slavery and racism was becoming made a part of the Constitution of the United States by certain Supreme Court decisions, such as the Dred Scott decision. And therefore, the nation eventually had to decide whether it was going to be slave or free, and whether it was going to be a union or a bunch of republics who could come in and leave as they wanted to. And we'll not get into all the politics of that. I live in the South now and have relatives who fought on the other side through marriage. And I also lived in the North most of my life and was born here, where I have relatives on the other side who fought in the Civil War. So it's a family problem. That's part of the reason that the Civil War and this whole question so intrigues the nation, because so many people were involved on both sides. Well, at any rate, the war, in a sense, the Wesleyan Methodists helped to bring the war on. Not that they were pushing for war, but they pushed the questions so radically that the nation had to give an answer. Not the only ones, but they were part of a great movement which began in Methodism in New England and New York City and thereabouts, called abolitionists. You see, there were many people, among them the Methodists, first of all, more than anybody, along with the Quakers, who believed that slavery was dead wrong, sinful. John Wesley started this when he said that American slavery was the most awful kind of slavery on the face of the earth, and there's been slavery ever since man began, as far as we know, and women have been around. But he said this was the most execrable, I don't like that word because it's hard to pronounce anytime, inexecrable villainy in all the world. In other words, it was utterly contemptible. So Wesley set the tone. And so when Asbury and others came to America in the Methodist Church, at the first General Conference in 1784, they said, no slavery. If you hold slaves, you can't belong to the Methodist Church. A very strong anti-slavery statement. But as we have been saying again and again, the Methodist Church more and more became the church of the people, became the popular church in America, became the church in which young people especially and people who were active in American life joined the Methodists. Now, not exclusively, certainly, but they were the leading edge, and they were the growing edge. And what that meant was that some of them began to get in positions where they had slaves. They were willed them, as was often happened. I have gone through a lot of the Southern history and family history, and you find slaves being passed on by will. So-and-so gets Rebecca, and so-and-so gets George, and so-and-so is to be provided for, or so-and-so, worst of all, is to be sold, which was one of the great evils of it. And so the Methodists began, in spite of all these evils, which Wesley had cried against, and which the early Constitution, they began to back off. And the rest of the story, and we can't take it in detail in Methodism, is that by the time of the 1830s, when Orange Scott and others first began to oppose this, and I mentioned there the name Orange Scott, who is considered to be kind of the key person in the organization of he's not the only one, but this is the name that comes up. It's a good name. I don't know why Orange, but Orange Scott is the single name which stands out most influentially in the formation of the church. He began to become abolitionist in conviction, and that was because there were means of trying to deal with slavery and with the black people who had been brought here from Africa by relocating them back to Liberia, particularly, and Sierra Leone in that area, which is now very much in the news, a tragedy of civil war in both those countries. And but they had to be bought from their masters because slaves were property, slaves were money, and big money later on toward the Civil War. And so to say you're just not going to have slavery would have meant that many of the wealthiest people in the South would have been deprived of their livelihood, just like in a recession, and there wasn't enough money to buy them out. So what happened was many blacks were bought from their masters and given a ticket back to Africa, first of all to Liberia, which was a black republic set up by American slaves that went back, and also into the neighboring territories such as Sierra Leone. But that was an impossibly slow process. And so finally, when that didn't work, a group of people said the only way to settle this business, and of course Lincoln was a moderate among them, he wasn't an abolitionist to start with, Lincoln and others said, we've got to do something else. But the abolitionists were the ones that said, not only we got to do something else, we got to do it or it's a sin. And the church is sinning that allows slavery. So what they were doing was condemning all the American churches, including their own Methodism, in this case Methodist abolitionists like Scott and Leroy Sunderland and others that you'll see in the history. They were all saying the Methodist Church either has to come out again against slavery and give them freedom, complete and absolute freedom, now. Here's your pragmatic now. That's what abolitionists said. Regardless of the consequences, we can't go on sinning. And of course, here's the conviction, you see, of a Wesleyan understanding of sin. In other words, if you know it's sin, if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship. If we don't, we're in trouble. And so they said, if the church doesn't follow the light that it has on this awful evil, regardless of consequences, and come clean, and as it were, what? Put all on the altar. The Holiness movement is kind of a background for the ethical side of this whole issue. Because you can't have a reform movement that lasts or is effective without having a doctrine of perfection. Now, I say that as a dogmatic statement, but that's an historical reality which has been tested. If you want to be a social reformer and change something that's really bad, if you're not basing it on a higher power and basing it on a perfectionist view that it can be done in the first place, then you're going to give up somewhere along the line. If you don't have an absolute base for your convictions, if you're just doing it because people will feel better, or because people will think you're nicer, or because you can get a government grant to do it, quote unquote, in modern times, then it won't last long and it won't come out very well. You have to have the conviction that what's happening is wrong and I have to do something about it, and that's based in some kind of religious conviction. And so when Orange Scott and the other leaders who left Methodism and brought in other Methodists like Methodist Protestants, primitive Methodists, and other Methodists from different traditions, and Congregationalists and Presbyterians were gathered in 1843, they all were united around the fact that slavery is a sin, and we have to do everything we can to get people to face up to it, and especially the churches. Especially the churches. And of course, Methodism was their church, so there were other abolitionists. There were non-religious abolitionists. But somebody wrote to Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, some of you American history students will recognize the name, was the editor of the Liberator, which was kind of a public abolitionist paper. And someone wrote to Garrison and said, unless you have a doctrine of perfection to back up everything which you're demanding, it will not be lasting. And so the religious element was a part of a larger movement, but a very important part. And the Methodists resisted it because they were now already entrenched as kind of being the American society, and who is going to disrupt American society and break it up in spite of the seriousness of the question. But when they began to be accused of being sinners because of it, that really cut. Because everybody who allowed slavery had all kinds of excuses for allowing it. And some of them were, the worst were the South, where they had biblical excuses, and supporters in the North to back them up. Such as this. This is God's way of getting the black people converted. Instead of us going over there, we bring them over here. And of course, we work them to death. And so we can have our plantations, which is what was true of much of slavery, not all of it. Some of it was less severe than that. But maintaining a nice lifestyle. And the result is, of course, that we are getting them converted because we're putting them in church. That was one thing. The other, which was much worse and much more subtle, was that the Bible talks about slavery. It doesn't say do away with it. It sends Onesimus back to his, sends a slave back to his master, Onesimus. It says take him back and so forth. Paul doesn't say buy him out and free him. And so others said, and this was mainly among Presbyterians, but Methodists never preached this, but a lot of the Southern ones believed it, and that was that slavery was God ordained, was in the Bible, that God had set up a slave class and a master class, and of course the aristocratic Southerners who were the leaders of the Confederacy were the master class, and the result was that God had ordained it. Therefore, actually, it's a God-ordained thing. Now, these are broad outlines. Now, I want to say quickly, so I don't get lynched when I go home. I want to say quickly that many people were drawn into the Civil War who had very little relationship to slavery, but who were doing it basically because the war was being fought on their territory, and they are like a dog is. We don't like people coming in regardless what the reason. We're going to bark. And so many people defended their homeland basically as the war began to develop into armies moving across the country. It got severe and severe. The ordinary farmer and the ordinary person fought on both sides of the war, basically not being very conscious of the slavery question. But the Civil War, as an American historian, I would have to say was basically a war over slavery, regardless of the fact that many people like to say it was a war for the Union. It was certainly that. It was a war to see whether we're going to keep a Union as an American people. But behind it all, the threat to the Union was slavery, the issue of slavery. It was tearing the country apart. Well, that's the milieu in which men like Orange Scott became so radical. You have to know that to see why. In fact, the Civil War question and the slavery question was called the inevitable conflict. By the time, and we have to remember this in history, we're coming close to it in some places, especially in the Far Eastern situation, unfortunately. Or I'm sorry, Near Eastern situation, where it looks like there is no way to get yourself out of the situation in any kind of a way that will be accepted by the humanity which is involved in it. The human beings are involved in it. And that's an awful alternative. And when America came to the Civil War, it was often called the inevitable conflict. In other words, we don't know how to stop it. We're on a train sliding toward destruction, and nobody knows how to get it turned around. And that was the mood in America just before the war began. And part of that mood, now to get back to our particular question, was the abolitionists who were saying, look, the only way we're going to solve this whole problem, war or no war, is recognize this is sin. And of course, America was very more conscious of the ethical word sin and so forth in that day. It's against God's will, and therefore it's got to go. Well, the Methodist Church itself didn't like that, as we're saying. And so they put a gag rule in. I love history because it's a study of people. They said, we're not going to talk about it. We'll just ignore it. And so Arne Scott, in one particular conference, I think in 1836, 1836 would have been, came in with about 34 different petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of people who said that the Methodist Church should do something about slavery. And the bishop said, we don't discuss that in this conference. So this is the thing that not only began tearing the country apart, but began tearing the churches apart. And so, finally, by 1843, men like Arne Scott had decided that the church was not going to deal with the issue. And by conscience, they felt they had to do something. And so the Wesleyan Methodist Church was basically started as a religious abolitionist denomination to gather together all the people who, for whatever reason, believed that this was an honest and just cause and believed that the churches were not going to do anything about it. And therefore we needed what? An abolitionist church where people could go and feel like they were in a cause that they could support. But therefore it was a reformed church. If you read our latest volume of collected essays, which is the history of the Wesleyan Church, the new church, as it goes back through the old churches, you will see it's reformers and revivalists. That's a very apt term. The Holiness Church, the Pilgrim Holiness Church, was basically revivalist. The Wesleyan Methodist connection, as it was known, was basically built on reform of the society. So in essence, and I mentioned this in the introduction to that book, in essence, the word Wesleyan and perfection is very appropriate for the church because it brings together holiness, the emphasis on purity, and on the other side, it brings together social holiness, which Wesley said has to go with it or else you don't have real holiness. So in a fashion, we're going to see that the Wesleyans believed in purity and the Pilgrims believed in social action in many places. But I'm saying the two churches represent these two wings of holding together a truth in Wesleyanism. And therefore, hopefully, Wesleyan is a prophecy of what the churches may do as they continue in their life, and that is to keep these two together and realize that without holiness you can't have social action, and without social action you can't have holiness. It's that simple. Because God said, love God and love your neighbor, and they're both right there. So in essence, he said, this is all the law and the prophets. That's why I have no trouble preaching holiness. And it's not a hobby. It's the thing. Amen. That's like saying, don't worry about salvation. Don't get on a hobby about having to be saved. Well, nobody would ever say that. Well, don't get on a hobby about preaching holiness. Unfortunately, many people take objection to that. But the simple fact is, this is the end. Wesley said that if one does not put the fulfillment of the image of God in the hearts of men and women as the end of salvation, they are not preaching full salvation. So when we go in many evangelical circles and only preach conversion, we are only preaching half a gospel. Only preaching half a gospel. And not only that we should do it occasionally so that people will know that there is such a thing, but it has to be the goal toward which we drive all our truth. And that's where we're all headed. So let's keep talking about it because it comprehends everything else. It's not a hobby. It's it's an inclusive thing which brings in all of Christ's planning and all of the Christian life together. And we should always keep that as this is the point where everybody who's a Christian has to be avidly heading. And, of course, the promise that we can reach a place where we can have that in our hearts, if not a perfect life in the sense of being perfect in everything we do. So the Wesleyan and Pilgrim Holiness churches represent both sides of that. If we knew our Wesleyan forebears, I'm talking now about Wesleyan Methodists, that's sometimes a problem with using the word Wesleyan because they were known as true Wesleyans, quote unquote. That was the name of the first paper, the True Wesleyan, in the Wesleyan Methodist tradition. Arne Scott and others published that. If we knew how radical they were, the only thing I can compare it with is the abortion conflict today. And I wish people would know more of their history. Those people who have been fighting the abortion battle would have been a lot wiser and a lot smarter if they had known their history. Because the simple fact is that if they had known about abolitionism and used that as a model, and here I'm just giving a little outside advice, I'm going to leave it very quickly. If they had used that as a model, they would have escaped many of the traps into which the anti-abortion movement has fallen. Now that's true of all history. We can learn a lot from the people who went before us. I always told my classes, don't laugh at the past because 50 years from now they're going to be laughing at you and say, what were those silly people thinking about? So be humble. So the Wesleyans were radical. They went right down into North Carolina. When the movement got going, the church was organized. They went down to North Carolina, which was in the heart of slave territory, and sent missionaries and established a few little preaching points. They were shot at. In fact, at Liberty Hill, North Carolina, the church is still there. It's been preserved. It's an historic site now, in which you can still see the bullet marks in the weatherboarding, where people shot at them during service because they were saying the slaves should be free. Adam Worth was almost lynched. He actually fled on his bail. He was out on bail, and he found out they were going to lynch him, and he fled at night and went back to Indiana. And when he got there, he paid back his bail. He was a good, honest Wesleyan, and never went back until after the war. And so this was a radical crowd, a bunch of New England radicals. They basically had their leadership in New England, and later on in Indiana. They were members of the Underground Railroad, and all of you will know what we're talking about there. This was a system by which slaves were freed in the South by spiriting them away and were given over to the care of this railroad system, which took them up north and finally got them to Canada, where they could cross Lake Erie or go across at Niagara Falls or somewhere up there, or get on a boat and go up the coast. But they got them out, and it was a series of secret houses and cellars and churches called the Underground Railroad. Very well organized, we know, because excellent books have been written on it now. And the main persons in the Underground Railroad system were Oberlin people, which is Finney's people, the Wesleyans, who were Arne Scott's people, and the Quakers. Those three groups were the main groups. And of course, they were the bane of the Southern system, because all of these slaveholders were losing some of their valuable property and being encouraged by it. And so what I want to say is I'm not sure that I know a lot of our contemporary Wesleyans, and by that I include myself, I'm not sure that we could ever get into as radical civil disobedience, and that's what it was. The same kind of thing that Martin Luther King practiced, that we could get into as much civil disobedience as they did. They freed slaves. They actually, Oberlin one time, a slave was caught near Oberlin, and all the students went out and snatched him from the sheriff and took him back and got him up to Canada. Boy, you look docile. You must be sleepy. Some of us wouldn't go out and ever raise a finger, and I'm speaking lightly, and wouldn't raise a finger in opposition to anything because it would be too public. You know, but this was they. This is what they were. And but with it was a strong doctrine of Wesleyan perfectionism in the Methodist Church. In the Wesleyan Church. In the first issue of his paper, after the church came into being, and I quote this passage in the new book which I just edited for the Nazarene Press on Holiness Classics, which I mentioned once before. I put this article in. Arne Scott says that if we are going to do what God is asking us to do, in helping the slave and helping to settle this issue, we must never abandon our Wesleyan doctrine of Christian perfection, because it is all based on that. And so there was a strong tie. Now I want to say quickly, the Wesleyan Church did not raise holiness as an issue, so in that sense they were not a holiness church to start with. Their problem was the episcopacy. They did raise an awful fuss about the bishops whom they felt had treated them unfairly in trying to deal with the issue in the church. And so they became very, very non-episcopal. When the Wesleyan Methodist Church was first formed, it was almost identical to a Baptist association. They called it a connection, which is more Methodist and a little more English. The Wesleyan Methodist Connection of America is what, and they became known as the Wesleyans. They had to say of America because there was always a Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain, which was the main Methodist church. In Britain, the Methodist Church was known as the Wesleyan Methodist Church. So they said of America. And they didn't mind doing that because the Wesleyan Methodist Church in Britain was strongly abolitionist, because Britain had already freed their slaves. So the association with that Methodist body was not innocuous, nor was the British Methodist Church Episcopal. The American church is Episcopal. They had bishops. And so when the church was organized, they did some radical things. You know, in Methodism at that time, there were no lay people at General Conference. It was all a conference of the itineracy, of the traveling preachers and the bishops. The Wesleyan Methodists said, we will hold no conferences or make any decisions in which we don't have equal lay and equal ministerial representation. And by the way, that is still in our church, as you well know. Sometimes it's hard to balance out a half a minister with 3/4 of a lay person, but nevertheless, that's what we have. That's what we have to do. And sometimes I was trying to think what it was like. There's something very parallel to this. Sometimes we have to create a few so that we can make it work out. But nevertheless, that was a much more democratic step in church organization. And eventually, of course, the Methodists have had to come to the same kind of situation generally, in which there's a significant, I don't know what the proportions are, significant lay presence in the general conferences, but that came much later. Secondly, they were very strongly open to the ministry of women. From the very beginning, women played a very important part in the ministry of the church, and like the Pilgrim Holiness Church, women's ministry was common in the Methodist Church, the Wesleyan Methodist Church. In fact, the holiness element in the church, which eventually developed after the slavery issue was settled, I'm trying to hasten here and just give the outline. Eventually, the church split, then the Methodist Church split. Just 1 year after the Wesleyans withdrew, the Methodists split wide open north and south. And when that happened, it was inevitable. Some people, when the Methodist Church split, said, now we see what's going to happen in the country, and they were right. See, the Methodist Church was so representative of the people of the nation that in 1844, which is 17 years before the war began, in 1844 it was practically determined that the nation was going to split and we're going to have a civil war of some kind. And so we have the Northern Church, which is called the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Southern Church, which was called the ME South, Methodist Episcopal Church South. And they developed. The Baptist split, and we got the Southern Baptist Convention eventually. The Episcopalian Church never officially divided, but they had a Southern and Northern Church, which after the war kind of got back together. The Presbyterian Church split, Presbyterian North, Presbyterian South. And in a nation which was still strongly dominated by religious feeling and religious evangelical, Protestant, religious concepts, you can see what a nation would think after every major north-south body had split. Things were not going well. But the Wesleyans were a big part of that. After the war, when the Wesleyans essentially had their question answered, after the war, the question was, are we going to continue as a church? Because remember, the one central element of their organization was what? Abolition of slavery. Well, with the amendments to the Constitution and with the proclamation of Lincoln in 1863, that was essentially done. Now, what were they going to do? Well, some of their main leaders went back to Methodism. Most prominent among them, Lucius Matlack, who was one of the original founders, a very well-educated person. Scott was not a well-educated person, except as Methodist preachers were. They kind of got their training on the job. But Lucius Matlock was a theologian. He wrote an excellent theology, which is still looked at with some respect. And he did it after he'd gone back to the Methodist Church. He said, the question's over. And I'm a Methodist, and I'm going to go back to the Methodist Church. And so the Wesleyans lost a lot of their leadership. But there was a certain element that said, no, we have gotten something which is not now represented by Methodism. And basically it was their democratic principles. And also the doctrine of Christian holiness, which at this time was beginning to be questioned in the Methodist Church. You following me? Building up to why they didn't all go back. Because they felt the Methodist Church of more than 25 years after they had left it was a different church. And it was changing in a way that they were not too happy with. And so they, in essence, said, we have to maintain a more primitive Methodism, a more old Methodism, which is now being lost by some of the larger congregations. And the result was that certain persons got, I believe, Adam Crook, and I just said Adam Worth a while ago. I'm pulling names out of the hat here of a lot of material. But Adam Crooks, I believe, was the one who was kind of the leader who led the Wesleyan Methodists back to a position of denominational purpose and unity. But this time, it was not in reform as the major factor. They never lost their reforming energy, totally. But it was now revival. It was now revival. And they became part of the holiness movement basically after the Civil War. They were always holiness, but they basically became a significant part of the movement after the Civil War. And the Wesleyan Methodist Church became a holiness church. It had camp meetings, much like the rest of them did, but it is not a camp meeting church. You see, it's before that. It's pre-camp meeting holiness church because they were Methodists. So as part of half of our church, we do have a direct strain of Methodism, which is not filtered through a large revival like the Holiness Revival. It is part of it, but it doesn't come out of the same milieu. The Pilgrims, therefore, come out of the camp meeting movement. The Wesleyans come directly, if you make a chart, and it's been done many times, come right off the Methodist Church and right down to merger. But nevertheless, they always were committed to the holiness movement and were always considered a part of the holiness church tradition. And so their biggest problem in the Wesleyan Methodist Church after the development of the church was how to organize. How do you get from being a connection with all these independent churches to where you have some central leadership? Well, even the Baptists faced this problem. The first thing they did, they elected a book agent. You have to publish. And if you're publishing a church paper, you can't do it in one local church if all the churches are to be represented. So they had to elect kind of a general official. And the Baptists do the same thing. With their book department and their missions department, they've got a whole lot of them. And the result is that gradually they found out that they needed more organization, but at the very moment when they should have had the organization to benefit from the loss of Methodism and holiness people to Methodism, they could walk right into another Methodist church, which would have been very much like the Methodism they were leaving, but holiness. What happened? They just found that there were a little bunch of churches, and some would accept them and some wouldn't accept them. There was no general organization, and when you ask why the holiness people didn't go to the Wesleyan Methodists and just end the whole thing and have no Nazarenes, have no Pilgrim holiness, it was because the Wesleyan Methodists were not organized to receive them. Certainly a lot of holiness people joined the Wesleyan Methodist Church, but they had no national organization, no kind of authoritative response which they could give to the mass of people. Now, it wasn't until almost the turn of the century that they actually began to seriously consider that they had to get general organization. And you can read this in Nicholson's book, which is the history of the church. And so gradually, what did they do? Well, now they are influenced strongly by the camp meeting movement. And now they begin to go back to their old Methodist organization through the Pilgrim Holiness and Nazarene churches, which are strongly related to Methodist organization, but are more Presbyterian in their mix. If you would ask me, what kind of church organization do we have? It's not Episcopal, it's Presbyterian. We have a representative organization of levels by which we work from the district on up by representatives, and finally have a general conference which has final authority. It's just a little different from an Episcopal system. And therefore, whenever we have to go to court on some kind of a church issue, we are generally classified as having a Presbyterian form of government in American society. So gradually, the Wesleyan Methodists followed the general mood of the Holiness movement. And at the time of merger, and I was intimately a part of all of this, as was Dr. Gonzalez and others that were involved in the preparation. As a part of all of this, we came to Dr. Nicholson, who was the first general superintendent of the church. And he was a very close friend of mine. He died just recently, one of the old men of the church, and a great person. And he was the first one to kind of hold the same position that Pilgrim general superintendents had for many years before. And that leads us, I guess, to the question of their institutions as a whole. The Wesleyan Methodists were a school-founding church. All of Methodists were. If we had all the schools going that the Methodists and the Holiness movement have started, we'd dominate American education. It's unbelievable. I know here we sometimes suffer with the loss of a campus, and some people were very perplexed by it, and some still are. And it is an awful thing to happen to any institution, to close it down in any way. I know that as well as anybody, because I had to supervise the reorganization of institutions after merger, and we closed 5 or 6 schools at that time. And it's not a pleasant thing to do, but God has blessed it in the church as a whole. We have strong schools today because of dealing with that situation. But nevertheless, they started schools. Adrian College in Michigan, which is now a Methodist Protestant school, was started by the Wesleyan Methodist Church. One of our problems in Methodism and in Wesleyan Methodism and in the Pilgrim Holiness Church is we started more schools than we could support. And we hated to do anything about it because our philosophy was, once God has planted a vine, we can't pull it up. There's a little bit of Calvinism, almost a little bit of predestination in that. But nevertheless, it got us into trouble. And so when the Wesleyans could not support Adrian College, the Methodist Protestants step in, and when you supply the money, you take control. And they took over the school, and today that is a United Methodist school as part of the merger with the Methodist Protestant Church. The interesting one for us today is the most influential evangelical school in the United States is Wheaton College, perhaps a second to Calvin or Calvin second to Wheaton, I don't know which, but 2 evangelical schools. And that was started by the Wesleyan Methodists. The Wesleyan Methodists started Wheaton College. That was a Wesleyan Methodist school. But again, they couldn't adequately support it, and so they called on the Congregationalists to come and help them, and eventually the Congregationalists put more money, this is a simple thing, put more money into the school than the Wesleyans did, and Wheaton became kind of a general evangelical college over the period of time. It is interesting that the Wesleyans maintained a seminary there until about 1897 and kept 2 professors on the faculty. But that eventually was done away with. And so we came up to merger in 1960s, 1966, and even before that. In 1940s, I know my father was on a merger committee, which isn't much talked about, with the Wesleyan Methodists. Steve Payne and others were on it. And that one kind of set the pace. And then in the 1960s, we really got serious. And we got serious basically because our institutions were going to be hurt if we didn't do something to support them better. We just had too few people to support as much work as we were doing. And so the churches seriously had to decide what they were going to do. And very quickly, I was in the middle of merger and at every level and every period, and saw the whole process right through as a member of the general board. And I just want to say this as a kind of valedictory to all of my life, that merger is one of the most satisfying experiences that I have ever enjoyed. Many mergers are mergers of desperation, of dying churches. Ours was not that the church was not vital in many ways. It was that we just had taken on more than we could bite. and we had to reorganize, which has happened many times in the history of the church. And basically the schools, which were our biggest budget items, were the question. And we needed accreditation, we recognized that. But I would have to say, as one of the fewer ones who are left now, who have been through the whole process in the church, that the merger it's one of the most successful mergers that's ever been undertaken in American Protestantism, not the biggest one. But as far as giving new life to a church and as far as expanding the vision of the church and opening up the church, these two churches found new life when they got into merger. And that is proven by the fact that within the years since merger, now about 25 years, how many years? 68 to now is only 22. 32, yeah, 32. I knew it had to be more than 25. 32 years from then till now, the church has more than doubled in size. It's kept growing. And the schools are all accredited, every single one of them. And the church has expanded. It's more pluralistic in the sense that it takes in other groups, like the groups that are coming in. I could go on down through. It's not the biggest church in the world, but if it had not been for merger, I don't believe that God would have been able to do what he has been able to do since. The challenges are great. The challenges are tremendous. And nothing about the future is guaranteed except God's promises. And so we have to find the way, and we have to continue the message, and we have to meet society where it is today, because the gospel was ordained not for the year 10 or the year 25 or the year 500 or 1,000. The gospel was ordained for people as long as the Lord shall allow the earth to continue as it is. We are the ones that are doing his work. And so in the coming of these churches, we have two holiness churches from two different origins complementing each other, coming together. A lot of people don't realize that every jot and tittle didn't matter. We operated this church in merger for a whole year without a discipline, each of us living by our old disciplines, with only a little agreement on certain principles. It was a great experience. In some other mergers which I've been involved in, where we tried to merge, we got every jot and tittle done and every little fine point done, and then we got all through, we laid it on the table. That happened with the Free Methodists. The Free Methodists have paralleled our history since 1860, when they were an abolitionist church who came out of Methodism in a second wave, and of course formed the Free Methodist Church, which we know well. And the simple fact is, we have been courting each other now. You want to know how long people can court each other? Almost since the two churches existed after 1860, and we've been doing it ever since, and we still have not gotten together. So that's why I think there's a miracle of some sort in the fact that these two older holiness bodies were able to be flexible enough under God's grace to get together in the hopes that God could use them more effectively. And that's why basically I have tended to be a Wesleyan, because I believe in the doctrine and the history, but I believe that the church offered an opportunity, far from perfect, not without its problems, but a church that still has some life in it and some freedom to do ministry, and for lay people as well. And, well, I think for whatever time we have, we are going to take a few concluding questions, because we have had to compress a lot into these hours. And I think we're going to take some questions, because especially on the last part, we have not covered the premillennial issue. I'm thinking of a few indispensable things. But let's take questions first, and if we can do that, we'll do it. Back here's a question.
My question was just exactly what you confessed you had omitted, and I wanted to see where that postmillennialism got transferred and transformed.
Okay, thank you for the opening. There's been a persistent question up here on that. Methodism in general, and most of America, were postmillennialist. And quickly to summarize that, what one believes about the millennium are oftentimes put in three categories: postmillennialism, premillennialism, and what we call amillennialism, which isn't a very good term, but that's the best we have. Postmillennialism is basically this: especially since the rise of the Holy Spirit age, in which the Holy Spirit is magnified, Methodism and other Spirit-filled bodies believed that the Spirit was going to make the force of the church so predominant in society that the church would kind of present a redeemed world to Christ when he came back to reign. You follow me? The city on the hill, that's right, of American dream. In other words, by the power of the preaching and evangelism, this is what drove missionary work in many cases, not always. But the fact was, we can sweep the world for Christ. This generation for Christ many times was a challenge to students. Well, in God's providence, whatever it may be, and perhaps in the reality that we underestimate the job, not the Holy Spirit can't do it, but how God's going to deal with the job, the simple fact is that many times in our history, and especially around the turn of the century, it didn't look like that was going to happen, because evolution came in, and all these forces came in. Civil War helped to destroy it, and all of that kind of thing. It looked like it wasn't going to happen. And so alternative understandings of the millennium came in. But, and I'll be brief here, and I'll have to pass some people by who haven't been into this as a special study. The simple fact was there was a movement arose in Britain called the Darbyite movement, which was the Plymouth Brethren. And the Plymouth Brethren came over here and widely dispersed the idea that there was going to be a connection between Daniel and between Revelation. And the weeks of Daniel meant a certain thing, and some of you know what I'm talking about, dispensationalism, the 70 weeks and so forth, that those are going to be a period of tribulation and trial, and the church is going to be raptured before that tribulation, and eventually God is going to come, and he's going to have to straighten everything out. So our main job is what? Our main job is to evangelize the world, but not that we're going to sweep it. It's to get ready so Christ can come back quickly, because he said he is coming back when the salvation plan is completed. So we're changing a little bit from a earth-centered salvation in postmillennialism to the church winning the world to a divine-centered God act in which God will step in rapture and millennium and all of that kind of thing and tribulation, and he will order things finally. That's premillennialism. Now, how did that get into the movement? We have to stop there and get that in. Well, we can't say why or how exactly, except those are some of the factors, but it was during the last decade of the 19th century, of 1890 to 1900, that significant elements of the movement began to take up the Darbyite, and it came basically from Darby and fundamentalism. It's a fundamentalist element in our tradition. And I know my dad was strongly dispensational premillennial. He taught this. In our camp meetings, you would see the charts. And it all came in because H.C. Morrison and L.L. Pickett at Asbury and other elements, but they were very dominant in the church, began to switch. They all had been postmillennialist Methodists. But at the turn of the century, perhaps because of the trauma the movement had gone through, I think that's an element. In other words, it had left Methodism or been kicked out, been thrown out, both of these constantly being put out, being pressured and leaving. And I think that trauma kind of did away with the rosy optimism that postmillennialism represented. And they turned kind of as it were to saying God's got to solve it. And so they took up the Darbyite teaching. And it became very much a fixed part. In the Pilgrim Holiness Church, we had an article of faith which we had to assent to as a part of the church articles. And that was a premillennial statement. We got that from the Christian Missionary Alliance, because the Christian Missionary Alliance was one of the leading premillennial exponents, A.B. Simpson and his whole group. That's part of the fourfold gospel. Premillennial return of Christ, divine healing, salvation, sanctification. That was a big thing at God's Bible School, which was another center for this. So without taking it further, all I can say is that at the break of the century and a little before, there was a dramatic shift, and some of the major holiness papers began pushing the other. Now, in the Wesleyan Church, it had less effect than others because the Wesleyans were Methodists by this route of breaking away, and they had a lot more postmillennialists than the Pilgrims did. And the Pilgrims, almost universally, premillennialism, because of the article of faith, was there. And when we came to merger, of course, the postmillennialists in the Wesleyan Church had withered so badly as has that movement. It's almost non-existent today, so that it wasn't a factor in merger. But we didn't put in the premillennial article. We merely put in that we expect the imminent return of Christ to come to judge the world, which is what? Which is an old, ancient doctrine of the early church. It's called Chiliasm, C-H-I-L-I-A-S-M. Chiliasm. And that is basically this, that Christ will return as he promised, as he left the mount, as the angels promised when he left the Mount of Olives. Christ will return. He will judge the earth. Therefore, we must look for him at any time. And as all of our Wesleyan premillennialists taught very heavily, we must occupy till he comes. We're not sitting here waiting for him. We expect him, but we're busy. Over here at the college, the chapel which is now torn down, in the middle of the entrance hall was a big motto, which was the motto of the school, occupy till I come. So I want to say this, there was a little bit of difference in the dispensationalism of the Holiness movement from the dispensationalism of the fundamentalist Calvinist movement, because they emphasize very heavily kind of, we can't do it, God has to do it, and we'll get everybody in the lifeboat, but there wasn't much concern for the world. More pessimism, that's right, it's a more pessimistic view. The Holiness people said, we believe Christ is coming back at any time, and they believed in the rapture, they believed in the dispensations, and taught them and had big charts in camp meeting and everything. They believed all of that, but they said as Methodists and as Wesleyans, we can't sit around, God's got some work for us to do until he comes. And so there's a little variation in the activism involved in this kind of an understanding. It was quite fundamentalist in the fundamentalist tradition, and yet it was a little different. And today, I would imagine that many of our people read LaHaye's books, or not LaHaye, LaHaye, and they read his books, and they generally think that that's it. Lindsay is what I mean. LaHaye's part of that more conservative tradition, but I mean Hal Lindsey. They read Hal Lindsey's books, and they're selling like hotcakes. They're making movies of them, and I am not casting any judgments on the finality of which way to go, but the simple fact is most of our people today are not avid in that. They take that as a kind of interpretation of the end time, but it's not the focus of our operation. For some people it is. And at one time it was in our history. Dispensationalism was kind of the thing that was always up there. I would have to say that for myself, I'm a Chiliast. I believe very strongly the Lord's coming back, and he's coming back when he wants to, and we should expect him at every moment. But I have a lot of doubts about the interpretations which have been made in between. I believe the Bible from cover to cover, but it always has to be understood, and I'm not sure that is the best understanding of that issue.